In cultures where human sacrifice was common, being a slave could be fatal. One king executed 2 each morning in gratitude for a good night's sleep. Another decorated his palace walls with their severed heads. Here, 127 slaves are being beheaded to fill a gap. A woman slave crucified to try and stop the rain. And if cruelty to slaves was nothing new, neither was exporting them.
Long before the transatlantic slave trade begins, there's an active trade across the Sahara, and slaves were one of the items that were taking north across the Sahara, and almost as important, into the Sahara itself, to the oases of the Sahara. Slavery ran the Sahara, as it were. The only people that dug wells in the Sahara were slaves. And the reason for that is because people died digging wells.
Africa's most valuable human exports were women, bound for Cairo, Baghdad, Constantinople.
If a girl was pretty and she was taken to North Africa to be sold for sexual purposes, the man that bought her would not have any sexual interaction for 2 months to make sure that she was not pregnant. And therefore, that when she did become pregnant, it was his child.
Boys were also sought after to satisfy the demand for eunuchs in the Arab world, and they had to be young.
The older you get, the more likely it is that a man will die by having his genitals cut off. In fact, even boys, the death rate, from what we can tell, was essentially 9 boys would die out of every 10 that were mutilated. So that, in effect, to produce 1 eunuch, you need 10 slave boys alive.
The trans-Saharan trade swallowed 3 million Africans, bought in slave markets like Salaga.
There were other slave markets in Ghana. In the northern part of Ghana, where we are right now, there were about 4 markets, including Salaga. And yet Salaga became the most famous because of its position. So Salaga was blessed, if you like, geographically, strategically.
Salaga stood at a crossroads in the slave trade. To the north, the road to Timbuktu, and on across the Sahara. Northeast, the Hausa trade route to Kano and Borno. Eastwards lay the old kingdoms of Dahomey and Oyo. This road ran south through Ashanti territory down to the Atlantic coast. An eyewitness described the scene.
We saw men fastened securely at their throats by cord, little children from 2 years old upwards, and women, young and old, naked except for a bunch of leaves. We saw a very old woman, quite 70 years of age, and heard she was bought for 8 shillings.
There were professional merchants who traded all over West Africa, across the trans-Saharan trade, and you would find them in Salaga market. Then there were the individual merchants, somebody wanting a wife, or perhaps the wife is barren. The person would come as an individual and come and purchase 1 female slave to marry to bear him children. So it was predominantly an African market, predominantly an African enterprise, predominantly an African setting.
It was the pre-existence of this African setting, in which millions had already been enslaved, that made the transatlantic trade possible.
There was a need for labor. There was a shortage of labor. Slaves were a source of labor. Slaves were a commodity. Their human dimension is forgotten. They are treated like gold or like any other commodity.
An assortment of 400 Negroes to be delivered. NB, the women as near as possible to be all virgins.
You may buy a certain proportion of small slaves of 4 foot to 4 foot 9, which you will get for a reduced bundle.
Observe that the boys and girls you buy be very black and handsome.
Males are preferable to females, and Gambiers or Gold Coast are preferred to others.
Slavery alters the political map. The transatlantic slave trade altered that political map even more. People, military officials, government officials, merchants, thieves, many people went to war or engaged in acts of violence because they knew that they could sell the victims.
Some of the songs that are still sung reflect this awareness that one could be raided. You know, like there's one song that says it addresses the people who are maybe bathed